When I left my ranch, I never imagined I'd return to find 138 brand new homes popping up on my own land. I'd gone away to help my sister recover from surgery, just a few months. Peace of mind, no urgency. I wasn't renting the place out. I wasn't selling. My land was supposed to be untouched, exactly as I left it. But when I pulled up the long dirt road, what I saw had me slamming on the brakes. There was a huge construction sign with a fancy name, Sunview Estates, a premier HOA community. The kind you see in brochures with white fences and dog parks. Bulldozers were moving dirt. Frameworks for houses were already up, rows and rows of them. I could hear the beep of machinery, smell the sawdust in the air. Workers walked around like they owned the place. Not a single person looked surprised to see me drive in. I got out of the truck and approached one of the workers. "What is this?" I asked. He barely looked at me. Said something about the HOA breaking ground last month, and how the development was ahead of schedule. HOA? What HOA? This was my ranch. I never signed a thing. Didn't sell, didn't lease, didn't agree to any development. The worker shrugged. He didn't know anything else. I walked deeper into the mess, heart pounding. There were already paved roads cutting through where my cattle used to graze. A decorative fountain had been started near the southern edge of the property, right where I had a well installed years ago. I didn't know what to say. I was standing in the middle of what used to be my home. And they were treating it like just another neighborhood project. That evening, I drove to the county records office, trying to make sense of it all. I asked for the most recent land filings for my property. The clerk looked up the parcel number, and then her eyes went wide. There were new permits on file, all approved: construction, plumbing, electrical, even zoning reclassification. It looked like a legitimate housing development. Except I hadn't signed a single paper. "Who filed this?" I asked. She pulled up the name. A company I'd never heard of. I looked it up on my phone. It was tied to a community real estate trust, and wouldn't you know it, the registered mailing address belonged to the HOA president from the next neighborhood over. I recognized the name. She had always been nosy about my land. Had once even asked if I'd sell a portion of it for a bike path. I said no back then. Guess she didn't take that well. I took copies of everything and went back to the ranch the next morning. I tried confronting the site manager. He gave me the runaround, said he worked for the development firm, not the HOA. That they had signed all the legal paperwork and were under contract. I asked him who owned the land. He hesitated, then told me the HOA transferred rights through their land committee. I showed him my deed. My original documents. The ones I've had locked away in my safe for the last 20 years. That's when things got quiet. He stepped aside to make a phone call. Meanwhile, I walked the perimeter, stunned at how much had changed in just a few short months. What used to be quiet open fields was now a maze of driveways and street signs. They'd even started pouring concrete for a clubhouse. It was like waking up in someone else's dream, except it was my land, and this wasn't a dream. I wasn't about to let this slide. The more I dug, the more I realized this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a full-blown scam. Someone from the HOA had filed forged documents, transferred false rights, and somehow passed county approvals without ever talking to the real owner, me. And worst of all, the development company didn't seem to know any better. At that moment, I knew this wasn't just about protecting my land. It was about holding people accountable, both the HOA for their shady dealings and the developers for not doing their homework. I took a deep breath and picked up the phone. I was about to turn this entire project on its head. I started making calls that same night. My first one was to my attorney, a guy named Mitch who's handled my land and livestock matters for years. When I told him what had happened, there was a long pause on the line. Then he said, "You're telling me there are houses being built on your land, and you never signed off on anything?" I said yes. His tone changed immediately. "I'm coming over tomorrow. Don't talk to anyone else until I do." The next morning, Mitch and I stood at the edge of the construction site, watching as concrete trucks pulled in like nothing was wrong. Mitch had brought copies of the original deed and surveyed maps, everything in black and white, proving I was the legal and sole owner of that land. He took photos of the new builds, the street names, even the HOA sign hanging near the entrance. Then he asked me a simple question: "Do you want to shut this down?" He didn't have to ask twice. By noon, Mitch had filed an emergency injunction with the local court. That meant the builders had to stop all construction immediately until the situation could be investigated. I drove down to the courthouse with him, where we handed over every piece of documentation we had. The judge didn't look thrilled. "This is a serious accusation," he said. "You're telling me a homeowners association built over 100 homes on land they didn't own?" Mitch looked him in the eye and said, "We're telling you it's worse than that. They forged ownership." It was a waiting game now. While the court reviewed the filing, I decided to dig deeper into the so-called development company. I started calling around, pretending to be a potential buyer. They told me the whole area was previously unused land owned by a community trust. A community trust? I laughed. That land was mine, always had been. It wasn't held in any trust, and I certainly didn't sign it away to be turned into a cookie-cutter neighborhood. I asked to speak with the head developer. The receptionist hesitated, then gave me an email address. When I reached out, the man who replied sounded surprised. In fact, he asked me flat out, "Who are you again?" I told him who I was, and his tone changed immediately. "I was told all legal clearances were in place," he said. The HOA's legal rep provided the documents. I asked if he had those papers on file. He emailed them over. And sure enough, the signature on the transfer deed wasn't mine. The name was right, but the handwriting was nothing like mine. I called Mitch again. He took one look at the signature and said, "That's not even a good forgery." We now had proof. Not just that the development was happening illegally, but that someone had forged legal documents and passed them off to a builder who didn't verify anything. Mitch sent a cease and desist letter to both the HOA and the construction company. Then he filed a lawsuit for fraud, trespassing, and damages. The court date was fast-tracked due to the scale of the violation. While all this was happening, the HOA finally decided to reach out, probably realizing their scheme had been exposed. Their president, a woman named Diane, had the audacity to leave me a voicemail saying, "This could have been resolved quietly if you hadn't involved lawyers." I played the message for Mitch. He laughed and said, "That's a confession if I've ever heard one." News started to spread in town. People couldn't believe the story. Some thought I was joking until they saw the stop work orders and yellow tape around the development. The construction workers had been pulled off site, and now the entire area sat in eerie silence. Half-built houses with no crews, equipment abandoned mid-task. It looked like a ghost town, frozen in time. What shocked me most was how calm the HOA tried to act during all of this. They sent out a community bulletin, saying there had been a misunderstanding in land allocation. Misunderstanding? That's what they were calling stealing private property and building 138 homes on it without permission. But they had no clue what was coming next. Because Mitch wasn't just filing lawsuits. He had another card to play, one that involved the very development company they tricked. And if it worked, the HOA wouldn't just lose their new neighborhood. They'd be the ones getting sued next. While the HOA was busy pretending this was all a clerical error, Mitch had been working quietly behind the scenes. He wasn't just trying to prove my ownership anymore, he wanted to hit them where it really hurt. And that meant dragging the development company into this, not as a villain, but as a partner. See, when Mitch reviewed the forged land transfer documents again, something odd jumped out. The paperwork wasn't just signed by someone pretending to be me. It was also notarized by a local real estate agent. Mitch cross-checked her license and found out she had ties to the HOA board president, Diane. Turns out, they were sisters-in-law. Suddenly, the forgery looked less like a mistake and more like a family operation. We took that information straight to the development company, the one that had already invested millions into the project. The CEO, a sharp guy named Jonathan, was furious when he saw the connections. "We built on stolen land," he muttered, pacing around his office. "And now our brand is on the line." Mitch leaned in and said, "You're the victim too. But if you join our suit, we can shift the blame where it belongs." That's when the game changed. Jonathan agreed to file his own lawsuit against the HOA for fraud and misrepresentation. He even issued a public statement saying his company had been misled, and that construction would not resume until all legal matters were resolved. It made headlines. Suddenly, the HOA didn't just have one lawsuit on its hands, they had two. And this time, the press was watching closely. But things didn't quiet down on my end. That same week, someone spray-painted the side of my barn with the words "land thief" in red. Ironic, right? I was the victim here, but the HOA was trying to spin the story in their favor. Diane held a community meeting and told residents that I was trying to exploit a legal loophole to take over the new neighborhood. Luckily, one of my neighbors filmed the meeting and sent me the clip. I forwarded it straight to Mitch, who just shook his head and added it to the evidence pile. Meanwhile, the court issued a temporary freeze on all HOA bank accounts connected to the development. That meant no more spending, no more HOA meetings funded by member dues, and definitely no legal defense using residents' money. It also meant panic. Homeowners who had just bought into the neighborhood started demanding answers. People were asking for refunds. Others were threatening to sue the HOA themselves. One homeowner knocked on my door and apologized. He said, "I didn't know any of this. I just wanted a place to raise my kids. Now I'm stuck in a house that might not legally exist." I felt bad for him, but I also knew this wasn't my fault. If anyone should pay the price, it was the people who orchestrated this from the beginning. With both lawsuits moving forward, Mitch started gathering witnesses. We found a few construction workers who admitted they thought the land sale was strange. One even said he overheard Diane bragging about how they'd never be caught because the rancher was out of town. That guy was willing to testify. Even better, Jonathan's development company handed over internal emails. One of them, sent by Diane to the project manager, read, "Let's just say ownership is flexible. The paperwork will be in order by the time anyone notices." That email became the smoking gun. The next court date was set for 2 weeks out, but the pressure was already cracking the HOA board. 2 members resigned. A third tried to blame everything on Diane in an open letter to residents. People were beginning to understand that this wasn't some harmless miscommunication. This was a calculated land grab. And as for Diane, she was still trying to act like she had things under control. But behind the scenes, her lawyer had already reached out to Mitch, trying to settle. Mitch told him we weren't even close to finished. Because what the HOA didn't know yet was that we had filed a petition to seize their assets. Not just to stop them from building more, but to force them to hand over everything they gained from the illegal homes. That included their biggest prize, the newly paved roads, the community center, and yes, every single house sitting on my land. Diane wasn't showing up to HOA meetings anymore. Her once perfectly polished speeches about neighborhood unity and forward progress had vanished. Instead, her name was being whispered in every cul-de-sac, in every garage-turned-gossip hub, like she was some kind of ghost haunting her own suburban empire. And while the development project sat eerily frozen, half-finished homes baking under the summer sun, I was watching everything unfold from the porch of my ranch, coffee in hand. What they didn't realize was that Mitch and I weren't slowing down. We were just getting warmed up. By this point, we had over 200 pages of documentation showing how the HOA had manipulated, lied, and coerced both contractors and homeowners. But what really added gasoline to the fire was a set of city records Mitch uncovered, hidden under what looked like routine permit requests. See, Diane had applied for development approval after construction had already started. She used a backdated signature from someone who didn't even work at the city office anymore. And when Mitch traced that paper trail, he found that a former HOA member turned consultant had somehow been paid over $80,000 for land survey services that were never performed. It was clear. This wasn't just HOA overreach, this was organized fraud. Now, remember that temporary court freeze on the HOA's bank accounts. It caused ripple effects no one saw coming. With their funds locked up, the HOA couldn't pay contractors, couldn't fund community events, and couldn't even cover basic landscaping. The pristine, manicured lawns of their precious new development started to wither. Fountains stopped running. Trash collection got delayed. And that's when the residents, who once blindly followed Diane, started turning on her. One of them, a guy named Rick, decided to start a petition to disband the current HOA board entirely. He showed up on my ranch one morning, nervous but determined. "I know you probably hate all of us right now," he said, "but I'm trying to clean this up. We didn't know. And we need help." I didn't say much. Just handed him a glass of water and pointed him toward Mitch's office trailer parked by the barn. Within days, Rick had gathered over 60 signatures. Word spread like wildfire. And then, like a perfectly timed punchline, one of the construction companies involved in the original build filed their own lawsuit against the HOA. They claimed unpaid invoices totaling over $2 million. They also included in their claim that they were verbally promised legal access to build, which, of course, never existed. Mitch called it the avalanche effect. Once it started, it couldn't be stopped. Meanwhile, my property remained untouched, legally secured and backed by every possible title record and zoning document. In fact, the Land Records Department issued a public correction notice confirming that I had never sold an inch of land to anyone. It was subtle, but it was like watching the final nail ease itself into the HOA's coffin. And that's when the media caught wind again. A local news crew came out to cover the mounting lawsuits, and someone leaked Diane's emails, the same ones Jonathan's development company gave us. One particular line went viral: "The rancher will never come back in time. Just keep building." It hit every news station in the county. Suddenly, Diane went from being a respected HOA leader to a symbol of suburban greed. And she wasn't alone. Her inner circle, 3 other board members, were named in the fraud investigation, and their personal bank accounts were subpoenaed. Still, Diane tried one last move. She sent a mediator to my ranch with an offer to settle out of court in exchange for me dropping all claims. The number on the paper looked big, 7 figures, but it didn't matter. Mitch didn't even blink before replying, "We're not here for hush money. We're here for justice." What no one knew, not even Diane, was that the state attorney general had just opened a formal investigation into the HOA's actions. Mitch had sent in all the documentation, quietly, over the course of 2 months. Fraud. Conspiracy. Forgery. Wire fraud. And misuse of HOA funds. Every one of those carried serious consequences, especially with this much evidence. And in the middle of all that chaos, dead lawns, silent fountains, frozen assets, viral headlines, and broken trust, I walked the same trail through my ranch every morning. The fences still stood. The horses still ran. My land hadn't changed. But the people who tried to steal it, they were watching their world crumble, brick by fraudulent brick. It started with a letter. Not from the HOA this time, but from a lawyer representing one of the homeowners in the illegally built neighborhood. The letter was carefully worded, full of legal jargon, but the message was clear: the homeowner was suing the HOA for fraud and seeking damages. Apparently, they had just found out their $600,000 home was built on land that didn't legally belong to the HOA, land that legally belonged to me. They were furious. Rightfully so. They had sunk their life savings into what they thought was a dream home, only to discover that the HOA had no right to sell the lots in the first place. And this lawsuit? It wasn't just a personal one, it was the first of many. Mitch was now fielding calls from attorneys across the state. Class action firms had caught wind of the scandal and were preparing coordinated lawsuits on behalf of nearly all the buyers. They were demanding refunds, damages, compensation for emotional distress, and penalties against the HOA board. Suddenly, the little empire Diane had built on my land became a legal war zone, and she was stuck in the middle with no armor left. At the same time, the county started its own audit into how permits were approved so quickly. Turns out, one of the HOA's board members was related to a zoning official. Once that thread got pulled, a dozen more irregularities popped up: missing files, falsified maps, and mysteriously altered building codes. The whole process was rotten from the inside out, and the county wasn't going to ignore it anymore. To make things worse for the HOA, the construction company that originally broke ground finally decided it was time to cut their losses. Their CEO issued a public statement saying they had been misled by Diane and her board, claiming they had been promised clear titles, verified permits, and zoning approvals, all of which turned out to be fake or grossly manipulated. They filed their own lawsuit, not just for unpaid work, but for reputational damage. Meanwhile, I was still on my land, watching it all unfold with a strange mix of disbelief and quiet satisfaction. I wasn't out for revenge, at least not originally. I just wanted to be left alone. But when someone tries to steal from you, bulldoze your rights, and bury your name in lies, you don't walk away. You stand up. Mitch and I kept building our case. Every email, every text, every shady contract Diane had tried to hide, Mitch had it all, neatly organized and time-stamped. And now, every new lawsuit from a homeowner or business gave us even more leverage. They all pointed to the same people, the same scam, the same lies. It was a domino effect, and Diane had started the chain with her arrogance. And yet, she tried to keep her grip. One morning, she held a town meeting in the unfinished clubhouse near the development's entrance. Only a few people showed up. Most of the chairs were empty. And those who did attend came not to listen, but to shout. Someone even recorded the whole thing and posted it online. It went viral within hours. The comments were brutal. People demanded resignations, refunds, and even criminal charges. The funniest part. Diane still tried to play the victim. She said she was misled by contractors, that she only wanted what was best for the community, and that no one could have predicted this mess. But the documents said otherwise. Her signature was everywhere. Her emails were full of phrases like "no need to involve the rancher," and "we can sort out the paperwork later." There was no running from that. And just when things seemed like they couldn't get worse for the HOA, the city issued an immediate cease and desist on all construction within the development. Code violations were stacking up: unsafe foundations, missing inspections, environmental damage to protected wetland zones that were paved over without permits. The entire neighborhood was labeled in legal limbo, and all further sales were frozen. The homeowners were trapped, unable to sell, unable to get full insurance, and unsure of whether they'd ever legally own their homes. And every one of them knew exactly who to blame. Diane had overplayed her hand. She thought she could outmaneuver a quiet rancher. She thought paperwork wouldn't matter. She thought I'd never come back in time. But now her entire board was collapsing, one resignation at a time. And from my porch, I could see the once busy construction site now eerily still, just rows of unfinished houses standing like monuments to her failure.